Welcome to the Shoreview Library this afternoon for our author talk. My name is Eileen Boder and I'm the manager here at the library. We've had a series of very successful programs in this past year, and if you want to know more, we have a calendar of programs, and it ranges from children through adults. We have so many programs that we now publish our program schedule every 2 months rather than seasonally, because it just was getting too big. So without further ado, I may have a little form for you to fill out because this is one of the programs that is sponsored by the Cultural Legacy Grant. And I'd like now to introduce Peter Guy, who's going to tell us his story, and we're going to listen to that. And I know I like listening to anything about Minnesota. I'm not a native Minnesotan, so I never took Minnesota geography or history, even though I lived here 30 years, but I still have a hard time placing things. But through literature, we learn so much. Thank you, Peter, for coming today.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I was surprised to see anyone, given how lovely it is outside after this unending winter that we're just wrapping up here. So thank you. I thought what I would do today, if it's okay with all of you, is talk a little bit about the Lighthouse Road and how it came to be, and then read a little bit from it, and then hopefully you'll have a few questions and we can have a little conversation afterwards. So you see I have this picture up here, and while I was researching my first book, it's called Safe from the Sea, one of the things that I would do on a sort of regular basis, just to keep myself familiar or reacquaint myself with the North Shore, is look at books of photographs of the area. Both of my novels are set up on the North Shore of Lake Superior, and both of them are really focused on the landscape and the sort of the mood and the atmosphere of the place. And so while I was researching Safe from the Sea, I kept landing on this picture of this group of, and there were a series of photographs, but I'm such a Luddite, I don't even know how to, it was a miracle that I got one picture onto a computer image. But the woman on the left here, I kept pausing to look at her, and almost the sort of way that I felt I was developing a crush on her or something. And I can't say why it was. It was really subconscious, but I did. So for years I was looking at this woman's picture, and each time I did, I would do a little inventing. I would think, oh, where did she come from? Or what is she doing there? Who are these people that are with her? What's the story? Where are they? I, of course, know where the picture is taken, and it's in a lumber camp in Ontario, and it's, I think, circa 1889 is the date of the photograph. But I just kept thinking about her, and I would think about her the way I would think about a character that I was actually working on. That is, she sort of just kept appearing in my mind. So when I finished Safe from the Sea, finally finished it, it was a long process, but I was ready to start something new, and I didn't really have an idea. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I didn't have a protagonist. I had an idea what the story could be about. I wanted to write a book about the lumber camps, and I thought it actually might just be a story. So I went back to this picture, realizing that I had a whole character already developed in my mind. And so I started writing her biography, and this is what I do, is just start making up the facts so that I can then begin the story. And I made her a Norwegian immigrant woman. I put her in a fictional town on the North Shore, and really just sort of built her whole life. And I envisioned, like I said, either a long short story or a short novel about her life and about her experience getting here, and was really excited about it. One of the problems that I had with Safe from the Sea is that it took me 10 years to write, and one of the reasons that it took 10 years to write is because I was so unorganized and just didn't have any coherent plan of attack at all. And I didn't want to spend 10 years writing another book, so I spent a lot of time mapping out the story and thinking that I was going to have this great plan and that I could do it in 10 months, say, instead of 10 years. Well, it got to the point where I was ready to start writing her story, I knew I didn't want to tell her story chronologically. I knew I wanted to start more at the end than at the beginning. And so I did that, and it became the first chapter of The Lighthouse Road, in which this woman on the end here gives birth to a son in a howling winter storm up in the fictional town of Gunflint, Minnesota. And I remember writing it and thinking, oh, this is going so well. This is such a great plan that I have here, and I'm excited about telling her story. And I got to the end of the chapter, and she delivers her son, and I realized almost immediately that I had to tell his story too. So this great blueprint that I had just went right out the door. And I was faced with a whole nother story and having to rethink the way I was going to tell it, and how would their lives intersect, and what would their lives mean to each other. The upshot was that it was such a joyous experience for me to write these two characters' lives. She gives birth, as I said, to a son, and their stories alternate in The Lighthouse Road. It's usually a chapter for her and a chapter for him, and back and forth. And I love the way that their lives were sort of giving meaning to each other's in a way that I didn't expect and didn't know. But what I discovered, in fact, when I was finished, was that I was really, really in love with these folks. In a sort of unnatural and disconcerting way, I felt they were my own ancestors. And I took that as a good sign. I think, I really enjoyed the process of writing the book, and I enjoyed reading the book when I was finished with it. But more than anything, I love this feeling that I had at the end of feeling like, oh, I'm really going to miss these two when I'm, now that I'm not thinking about them every day, and I'm really going to miss not inventing their lives and telling their stories. And this got me to thinking recently. I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago to like the Friends of the Gustavus Adolphus Library, and it was the day after the Boston Marathon bombings. And I had actually written a whole speech and was prepared to give this speech about all sorts of things, not least of which is the importance of libraries. But it felt wholly inadequate to talk about that after what had happened. I'm not quite sure why the events in Boston shook me so much, but they did. And I ended up, as I went up to the podium, in fact, to give this talk, deciding that I wasn't going to give this speech at all, that I would just talk about why it's important, I think, that we read and write books and what we can learn from it. It seemed like, what am I'm just up here talking about this book that doesn't matter at all. These people are suffering so greatly. But I realized, almost as I was talking about it, I shouldn't say that. I've always had this sort of feeling about why I do this, that is, write books, and why, and maybe more importantly, why it is that I'm such a voracious reader. But it really crystallized for me there, because I was feeling like, we should just be, pooling money and sending it out to the victims, that kind of feeling. But I realized, and I think this is maybe part of the reason that it crystallized for me, was in light of the experience that I had writing this book, was that one of them, maybe the best reasons that there is for reading books and for me in writing books, is that we learn, however far the experience is from our own life, how to empathize with people. And I think that's a word that gets tossed around lightly, but I realized how much I, in fact, empathized with this character that I had created. And that is probably why I loved her and her son so much. And so I've been thinking about that a lot lately. And these, people are so often left speechless when something like this happens in Boston. We don't know how to reconcile such a horrible act with our daily lives and everything else. But I've been dealing with it, I've found, and dealing with other stresses in my life vis-a-vis what I've read, and the way that I've learned to empathize with people, to sympathize with people, through reading books. And of course you learn that in real life as well. You have to, or you're a social misfit. But it's helped me so much, not just recently. Looking back, I realize it has helped me more in my past than I realized. Just what happens to the characters that I read about. I don't know them. They're not experiences that I've had or ever will have. And in the case of the books that I've written, I just make it all up. But what have I learned from that? And I think that one of the main things that I've learned from that is that you learn how to handle real problems, real issues, and grapple with real issues of morality via the lessons that you've learned reading. And so it's been a lot of fun lately, in fact, with this sort of realization and with the talks that I've been giving, to reacquaint myself with the characters in this book. And I've made a point lately of reading only sections that I've never read before. And I'm going to do that again today. As I said, Thea, the woman that I imagine on the left here, comes from Norway to northern Minnesota expecting to find the life of the American dream. You know, we're programmed, I think, sort of to believe that it is the land of, and of course it is. I would never say that it isn't, but you know, you come here and you work hard and your life is full and meaningful, and everything goes according to Hoyle. Well, I don't think that that's always been the case. My own grandmother was a Norwegian immigrant, and I heard lots of stories from her, though they eventually did live the sort of the American dream. It wasn't always easy. And that the fact that it wasn't always easy and the fact that she was a first-generation immigrant always really interested me. And it was really one of the starting points. One of the questions I most often asked myself with respect to this character was, why is she here? Where did she come from? Why did she come here? Who is she coming to see? And it was the springboard for the whole book. And so I'll read a section. It actually takes place very near the end of the book, but it's earliest, chronologically, it will be one of the earliest scenes in the book. So each of the chapters begins with a date. And this is October of 1895. In an examination room on Ellis Island, an immigration official asked Thea for her final destination. Gunflint, Minnesota, she said. The Norwegian-speaking immigration officer checked one of a dozen ledgers on his desk. Gunflint, you say? He checked another of the ledgers. There doesn't seem to be a place with that name. Thea was, of course, confused. She told him her aunt and uncle lived there. She gave him their names as though that might prove its place on a map, its place in a ledger. How will you be getting from here to there, he said. She told him she would be taking a train from Hoboken to Chicago. From Chicago, she'd take a steamer to Duluth. From Duluth, another steamer up Lake Superior to Gunflint. She told him her uncle raised cattle. The immigration officer consulted an atlas of Midwestern states. He summoned another official, and after a brief consultation, they settled on Duluth, Minnesota for Thea's final official destination. 5 hours later, she was on a barge bound for Hoboken. She would not remember these days, or would remember them only as a blur, as though she had passed through the train station in Hoboken in a dream. The locomotive was another dream, and the 2 days it spent on its way to Chicago were still other dreamlike days. In Chicago, at Union Station, she stepped from the train into the strangest world yet, a building so grand and in such contrast to anything she had ever imagined that it frightened her. All that noise and motion and clamor like a taut string about to snap. And outside Union Station was another kind of tension, another kind of dream. The buildings above her were shrouded in fog. A kind of rain fell and drenched the penny map she held before her. On Michigan Avenue, she walked north to the river and found the docks of the Chicago, Sioux, and Duluth line. In the ticket office, she bought a third-class berth on the Sioux for $7. She had only 4 hours to wait for her 3-day cruise to Duluth. The Sioux passed through the locks onto Lake Superior in the middle of the night. It rode out of Whitefish Bay, the moon on the horizon, its lodestar. It was cold, and even as the boat sailed ahead, a breeze came up the stern, hitting Thea's face and bringing tears to her eyes. The Sioux docked in Marquette at midday. For half an hour, stevedores unloaded and loaded cargo. A dozen passengers debarked, another dozen boarded. In the dark of night, they docked again, this time in Ashland. The same exchange of passengers and goods. Another half hour spent in harbor. The following morning, Thea stood on the stern deck again. Again, she watched the sunrise behind them, still the stiff breeze trailing. It was fully day when the Sioux landed at the Chicago, Sioux, and Duluth line docks in Duluth Harbor. She thought the fledgling city rising before the hills looked something like Tromsø. Even the air had an Arctic quality, chill and damp. The offices of the North Shore Ferry Service were located right on the harbor, behind the livery and the enormous Board of Trade building. Thea entered and waited while a man behind a barred window sold billets to two families in line ahead of her. When finally it was her turn, she approached the window. She had clutched in her hands the phrase book she'd been given for just such purposes. In a halting whisper, she said, "Gunflint, Minnesota, please." "Speak up," the man said. Thea collected herself and repeated her request. "Opportunity sales tomorrow at 7 a.m. Passages $2.20. He spoke in a loud voice, avoiding her pleading eyes. "Will you take a ticket? There are others awaiting my services here." He gestured to the queue behind her. Thea reached for her purse, pulled some crumpled dollar bills from it, and put them on the tray under the bars. The ticket vendor looked at her finally, exhausted. He took a deep breath. He shifted his visor and said, "Do you understand the boat leaves tomorrow?" She answered with an unconvincing nod. He took another deep breath and shifted his visor still again. "Wait a moment." He stepped into an office behind him and returned in a moment with his own phrase book. He made his best effort to put the same question to her in Norwegian. In English, she said, "Yes, tomorrow." He nodded and set about preparing her boarding card. He made change for her payment. Thea, emboldened by the exchange, added, "I am new in America." Without looking up, the ticket vendor said, "I'd never have guessed." She walked up Lake Street past Superior Street, dodging the mule-drawn streetcars, slipping on the rain-slicked cobbles. Farther up the hill, on the corner of Lake and First, she paid $1 for a room in a boarding house, another dime for a hot bath. It was her first proper bath since leaving Hammerfest, and as she soaked in the tub, she was overcome with fatigue. So rather than going out for a hot meal, she finished her bath and dressed in her freshest clothes, and by the light of a window, read her Bible. She read it with a fervency she'd not felt in ages, starting with 1 Corinthians. She read for a long time. Even as her eyes felt heavy and the softness of her rented bed called, she read. When finally the evening fell and the light from the window waned, she laid herself down and slept, the good book clenched to her heart for more than 12 hours. When she woke before dawn, she felt a moment of panic before she realized where she was. She quickly gathered her belongings, washed her face, pulled her hair back, and donned her bonnet. By 6 a.m., she was back on Lake Avenue, headed for the docks. The Opportunity was a two-masted schooner, and her crew was drunk and quarrelsome even as the passengers boarded. The rigging and masts were plagued by a colony of dogs, and the singing of the lines in the wind was a song that brought Thea back to the harbor and Hammerfest. It reminded her of why she was making this journey. She stood on deck, her bags between her feet, as the Opportunity was tugged through the canal and out onto the lake. The sails were raised and they filled, and she felt the old pull of a boat borne by the wind. The boat moved into a quartering breeze, its progress slow, the roll of the water sharp. The spray rose above the decking, met her waiting face. 4 hours later, the crew was already lowering the sails. The weather the wind had brought in turned cold and foggy, the conditions worsening the crew's already sour mood. They weighed anchor and dropped a tender and announced 2 harbors. For an hour, she stood on deck and watched as the tender made trips in and out of the fogged harbor. 10 travelers debarked, none boarded. The rest of the day was slow moving. At sunset, they anchored outside Otter Bay. All afternoon, Thea had had the strange sensation of going back in time. Whether it was the way the boat moved under sail, the sharpness of the cold wind, or the prehistoric wilderness they were traveling past, she could not have said. At midnight, they stood at anchor outside the settlement of Misqua. The boat's captain told Thea and the 3 remaining passengers that they would have to wait until morning to sail to Gunflint. So Thea went below decks and found a bench to rest on, using her carpet bag as a pillow. The ship heaved all night, even as the wind died and the rain began. Sleep was impossible, and not only because of the ship's rolling. She felt, after this long month of travel and tribulation, the relief of being so near her destination. She felt the excitement that should have been accompanying her all along. In the morning, they woke to more heavy fog. The lake was now coming in slow undulations. The lines rang up on the mast, the gulls swarmed in the broom, and the crew was hung over and at odds over whether to weigh anchor or wait for the sun, which showed promise in the east, to come burn off the fog. They waited for 2 hours, the fog more blown away than burned, and raised sails under a southwesterly breeze that brought as much warmth as it did smooth sailing. They traveled the last 30 miles of shoreline in little more than 3 hours. As they turned toward shore outside Gunflint, Thea saw the town spread sparsely along the harbor. The fish houses, the hotel and apothecary, the church steeple up the hill. From the quarter-mile offshore, with the exception of the trees, it looked just like Hammerfest. And as her heart raced, it also sank. The boats rowing out to meet them looked exactly like her papa's fishing skiff. The water was as hard and as cold as the North Sea. The wind, even as it brought a warmer day, had every quality of bitterness that the air back home had. Had she really traveled so far to end up where she'd started? Rather than dropping anchor again, the crew reefed the sails and turned for the harbor. It seemed a difficult maneuver, as the ship was large and the harbor entry narrow, but the crew was practiced and sidled her right alongside the lighthouse road. 2 of the deckhands jumped ashore with lines and tied her off on cleats. On the lighthouse road, several townsfolk had gathered. Thea, standing behind the mizzen shroud, her heart aflutter, looked from face to face for the welcoming smiles of her aunt and uncle. She panned the crowd twice, each time coming away empty. She sat on a crate on a deck, disbelieving. "Last stop," one of the crew said, "Gunflint, Minnesota." Thea looked at him. He had a wind-worn face. His hair was tousled. His hair was a tousled mess. His coat was open and sagging on his large shoulders. "Miss," he said as he stepped near, "all passengers must get off the boat now." Thea understood enough to grab her bags and land. As she rose, clutching her handbag and shouldering her carpet bag, she noticed the man with the camera box standing below her. He had the lens pointed at her and snapped a shot. It was Hosea Grimm, his Kodak at the ready as it was every time a boat landed in Gunflint. Thea moved to the plank that had been laid down as a gangway. She crossed onto the lighthouse road and stood with the opportunity in the background. Hosea Grimm took another picture, then flashed her a puckish smile. It was not long after the crowd had dispersed, after the crew of the Opportunity had unloaded their cargo, after Hosea had collapsed his tripod and boxed his camera and arranged delivery of a pallet of dry goods for his apothecary, after the sun had come out full and all the morning's mizzle had been burned away, it was not long after this that Thea sat on the bench on the lighthouse road with her bonnet crumpled in her fists. Her sobs were there for the whole world to see and hear. Hosea approached her with his hat in his hands. He had been watching her from the corner of his eye as the crowd scattered, watching as the expression on her face shifted from expectant to nervous to despairing. He knew all at once that he must help her, simply help her, so he stood silently before her for a long time, his feet surely in view of her downcast eyes. When finally she looked up, Hosea said, "Hello, miss. I trust, based on this attitude of despair, that your landing has not met your expectations." She looked back at her bonnet in reply. "My name's Grimm. I'm a merchant in town. I'd help, however I might." Now Thea met his eyes, an act that spoke as much to her situation as her tears, for she'd long been taught to avoid the gaze of men, and in a tremulous voice said all at once what a horror her journey had been. She talked a full minute before Hosea interrupted her. "Beg your pardon, miss, but you're speaking a language I don't understand. Do you not speak English?" She returned her blank stare to her bonnet. "You've come from far away, I bet. From far away. Norway, I presume, judging by that gibberish you speak, or Denmark, or Sweden." He was speaking as much to himself as to her, and he kept his chin in his hand as he studied the masts of the schooner tied to the lighthouse road. "Probably Norway if you're staking a claim here." Now he knelt before her, played his hat brim through his hands. "Norgie?" he said. Thea looked up. She wiped her eyes dry with the backs of her hands, cleared her throat, and said, "I am new to America." Grimm smiled. "Welcome," he said. Without asking for permission, he lifted her carpet bag and said, "Come along with me." With his spare hand, he lifted his tripod and camera box and started up the lighthouse road. Thea followed because she knew no other option. Outside the offices of the Gunflint Axe and Beacon, Hosea stopped, set down all that he carried, and opened the door, holding it for Thea. There were 4 men sitting at desks. One of them was Selmer Gunderson, who did the typesetting. He'd been in Gunflint for 8 years, before there was a lighthouse road or brick building. He'd emigrated from Bergen. Selmer, Hosea said, I need to borrow your old tongue, friend. This here young lady landed at noon. She speaks hardly a word of English. Selmer rose from his desk, wiped his huge hands on the apron he wore, and came to stand before Thea. He removed his spectacles and addressed her in Norwegian. Hosea tells me you've just landed. Who were you expecting to meet? Feeling a surge of relief, Thea spoke rapidly. I've come from Hammerfest. My uncle is Rune Evanson. I've come to help on his farm. She paused, withdrew a letter from her purse addressed to Miss Rune Evanson. She offered it as some kind of proof. My auntie was to meet me. She paused for a moment, then asked the question she now feared the answer to. Why wasn't auntie here to meet me? Selmer looked at Hosea, who stood with his hat in his hands again. The lass is here for Rune Evanson, he said. She's his niece. She's come an awfully long way. Thea looked from Hosea to Selmer and back again. To Selmer she said, Is auntie okay? Looking at Thea, Selmer addressed Hosea again. What should I tell her? Hosea stood with his finger tapping his pursed lips for a long moment, then said, Tell the lass the truth. Tell her our aunt hanged herself from the barn trusses, how old Rune has lost his mind. Tell her she can stay with me until we figure out what to do. He paused. Tell her about Rebecca, that she'll have a friend. Thea spent 2 days and nights boarding at Grimm's. At the end of her second day, he put her on the back of a wagon bound for the lumber camp on the Burtonwood River. The previous morning, Hosea had asked her if she could cook. He did this with the typesetter translating again. When Thea said yes, of course she could cook, he told her that Trond Erlandson needed help at the camp. He told her that for around $1.50 a week, she could winter upriver. She could take stock in the spring after her season in the woods and decide on her future then. All of this, he said, was provided she did not wish to return to Norway presently. Thea sat there dumb, trying to see herself in the woods, and because she could not return home, and because it was harder to fathom an alternative than the prospect before her, she agreed to go. Thanks. So that's almost at the end of the book, but before that we see her whole story played out at the lumber camp, and Ode's story, of course, afterwards, or running parallel to her story. And that's the Lighthouse Road, and that's Thea up there on the screen. Except I think she has blonde hair in real life. So if there are questions, I'd be very happy to take them.
Did you?
Yeah, it was a really interesting. I mean, there were other ways to go. She could have, of course, taken a train to Duluth from Chicago. But there was something about that, and I think it might be my own love of traveling in unconventional ways that made me write her story that way. There were ferry lines that ran all around the Great Lakes, of course. The ferry lines in here are fictional, and of course, once at that time, in the that long ago, there were no roads running along the North Shore. So that part would have been unless she was running a dog sled or a wagon. She wouldn't have been able to get up to Gunflint, which is roughly, say, Grand Marais or something like that.
That's what I thought of.
Yeah.
Grand Marais when
Yeah.
you said Gunflint.
Yeah. But I loved that part of it, and that was really one of the, like I said, one of the big sort of impulses to tell this story was this wanting to tell her story, and in fact, wrote much longer chapters about her journey. I think there were 4 or 5 of them originally, and I just sort of kept paring them down. But it was so fascinating to me. And in fact, as I did the research on it, there's a wonderful website. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's something about for tracing your Norwegian ancestry. And they have all these ship manifests of, just perhaps 100 ships, real life ships. In fact, the Thingvalla, the ship that Thea's transatlantic ship was a real ship. and it was just endlessly fascinating to me. In fact, I lost a lot of time to work just being curious, reading about the conditions aboard those boats and what the any little detail, how much it cost, what the ships were like, what their cargo was other than passengers, how many passengers there sometimes were, and how many trips they made. Is just maybe the most amazing thing was these ships would just go back and forth year after year, and it was like, a buses going back, and not very many people going back to Norway, and a whole lot of people coming from that part of the world to the U.S., which is really, again, that notion, which was such a big part of starting this book, wondering about, why they came and what they were leaving behind and what they were looking forward to.
Was it poverty that they left behind?
Largely, yes. There were, of course, waves of European and, of course, Norwegian immigration, and there were different sort of leading causes all along the way. And by the time Thea came, it was, though there was still plenty of poverty and hardship, it was as much, I think, and this is my interpretation of history, not some historians, but it was as much that so many people had come, and there was so much news of this better life, of this, of all the land, and especially in this part of the world. And so I think that they were coming as much for the idea of America as they were for what they were leaving. It had as much to do with that as it did what they were leaving behind in Norway. Oh, not unusual at all, in fact. And this is another fascinating part about researching the vessels and such. They were quite large boats for the time, ships, and they had all the quarters were sectioned off. So I forget who was where, but there was a bachelor's section, and a family section, and a section for young women and young women with children. And in fact, there were many, many, many young women with young children coming to meet their husbands who had come to, get started. So it wasn't uncommon at all. And that again was just, I think about, a young 15 or 16-year-old girl being faced with this sort of voyage without any benefit of the language, very little money, a bag of food and a little bag of belongings, and that sense of fear that she must have had, but also the excitement that probably would have come along with it. For Thea, it's less excitement than fear, although she does, feel a couple of moments of excitement along the way. But for something about that true history translating into fiction is such an interesting thing for me when it's, when there's so much real life to base it on, millions of people living in one way or another this journey. It was pretty fascinating to me. He's a really interesting character in terms of how he came to be, and in the way that I developed him. I mentioned at the outset that when I decided to write her story, I start with a biography. So anytime I have a character, I will write their biography. And I don't mean, in the 4th grade, she learned how to skip rope. What I mean is she's born here, this is her family, this is her, this is what she looks like physically, this is where she, how much education she has, these are some of her interests, these are some of her skills, just sort of rudimentary facts about their character. And I do that in order to, I think of it as having a foundation to understanding their characters and their motivations. Once I get into the storytelling part of it, why would they react to certain situations in this way and not this way? Part of that has to do with what I understand about their life and where they came from. And I knew that with Hosea, I wanted this sort of eccentric man to appear on the scene in this burgeoning town and just stake his claim. And he just came, and he was going to set up his apothecary and run his business there. And he came with his daughter, who it's no secret to say that she's not his real daughter. You learn that very early in the book. But he's just going to come, and this is who he is. And I started once I had conceived of that. I thought, okay, now I've got to get his biography down. And I started writing it, and I stopped. I said, I just don't want to know about him. I don't want to know. I don't want to be hindered by my knowledge of this character. I want to be able to have him do anything and have him be capable of anything. And I knew that I wanted him to be that sort of nebulous or morally ambiguous sort of character. I didn't know to what lengths I would take that. And I was frankly surprised by that. But I love his character, not in the way that I love, just as a kind of a, the creepy factor. But also, he's capable of great goodness. I mean, he really, in my mind, he really genuinely loves Ode and Rebecca, and was very fond of Thea, and probably would have loved her, and wanted to take care of them. So he's got these impulses that, I guess we all have good and bad instincts and impulses, and his bad impulses are obviously a little worse than most of ours are, but I think maybe his good impulses are too. And I love that idea of having a character who is so morally ambiguous. And I still, when I think about him, I don't know what to, after all the time I've spent with him, I don't know whether I love him or hate him. I don't know whether I want to kick him in the pants or, I haven't written a lot of characters like that. No other characters like that, in fact. And it was a lot of fun to do it. Even as he's such a creep. The creepy stuff that he does is so creepy. And my wife, of course, was surprised to know I was capable of writing a character like that. But, yeah, and I actually researched that. I mean, as much as you can research that sort of thing, but there were fortunes to be made, and that is his fortune. I imagine that hidden somewhere in that apothecary is a trunk full of cash money that maybe it'll be found someday or something by a future character. But yeah, there was a lot of money to be made that way. And of course, I also think that he was, he's obviously a shady enough businessman and a diverse enough businessman that he was making money elsewhere too. So yes, he was a wealthy man, at least thanks partly to his business. Yeah. The name of Ode.
Odd. I call him Odd.
Yeah, everyone does. But in Norwegian, it's pronounced Ode. I'll try to humor you with a short story. But my wife and I have 3 kids, and when my wife was pregnant with the first kid, we didn't know if it was a boy or a girl. But of course, you get excited about naming your child, and we agreed completely on a girl's name, but whenever it was time, we should talk about names. What do you think we should name him if it's a him? And I had all these names that I genuinely loved and wanted to name my children, and would still have been happy to name them, including names like Olaf and Gustav and Norwegian names, strong, sturdy Norwegian, Magnus, and she wanted nothing to do with that. She's a German-Irish girl from Milwaukee, and so, but I always say that because I couldn't give my real children names like that, I give my characters names like that. But I can't tell you how many talks that I've given and conversations that I've had where people want to know about the name and where it came from. And it's such an unpremeditated story for all of the names in the books, in the book really. But Ode, we have Norwegian friends, and one of their sons' name is Ode Einar, and I just loved his name for some reason. And I thought I would call a character Ode from the time that I met the real Ode. I didn't know that it would be sort of that it would fit into the weirdness of the book. I didn't know how weird it was going to get, and so that I don't know. I think what I've learned is that I'll taper the names back a little bit. And then, for example, the next book has characters named Charlie and Harry and Gus. And
It's kind of interesting, though.
yeah, but I think for a lot of people, I'm not one of those people. I don't mind a strange name, but for a lot of people, I think it's a distraction. And it shouldn't be, I don't think. I think you should have an open mind about it. I try to. But it's not so important to me. It's really a novelty to me how I name the characters. Hosea, for a couple of years, I was addicted to watching the television show Top Chef. And there was a contestant named Hosea, and I just thought it was a cool name. Never mind all the biblical references that I didn't even know about until I started getting questions about it and had to look into it. So it's not as scientific as it seems. And I know for a lot of other writers, I know a lot of writers who put a lot of energy into coming up with the names and why they come up with certain names, and they have either biblical or literary references to something else. And I guess I'm just not smart enough to think that way. I just name people things that I like. Yeah. I do, and I of course identify with Ode. I think just given the fact that we're both men, and I really I often say that he's the sort of man that I wish that I could be. I'm not as focused as he is. I'm not as simple-hearted or as pure-hearted as he is. And they're both qualities that I love and wish that I had more in my own personality. And I would love to have lived his life in a way. I mean, of course, not the motherless part of it, but live at that time doing what he did. I love the idea of that sort of simplicity. And so in that way, I identify with him. But I also really identify with Theo in a strange and complicated sort of way. And I don't know if it's, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I'm not so sure that it's identification as much as empathy, but I just have such a fondness for her that I can't stand it. Like, I still get sad thinking about her life. And she lives with me larger than any of the other characters live with me, I think. And she really still does. I mean, I will sometimes wake up having dreamt about her, as if we were, as if I knew her, as if she were my grandmother or something like that. So it's a very strange relationship that I have with her.
How does your wife feel about that?
Well, given the fact that she's dead, she's fine with that. But yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. Give us the ending.
The ending, boy, I get a lot of questions about the ending too. When I discovered, after writing the first chapter, that I wanted to tell Ode's story too, I immediately started thinking, oh, well, actually, I could tell her parents' story and her aunt and uncle's story, and I could tell, Ode could have a child someday, and I could tell his story, and, I had this all of a sudden, and I started writing it like that. I actually spent a couple of months writing it like that, and had a timeline into the 1970s. But what I realized was that the book would be 1,000 pages long, and it would take me not 10 years, but 20 years to write that way. And not that I wouldn't mind reading a book like that, but my publisher probably wouldn't be interested in publishing a book like that. And a lot of people, I think, wouldn't be interested in reading a book like that. People read long books all the time, but it's certainly not, it's not a good career move by any estimation. And so I thought, well, I could do what I have them planned and am now doing, and that's write a couple of more books after this that take place revolving around the same family. And I didn't know how I could do that best, and still be true to this book. And one of the things that I'm sort of fond of thinking about, and that I really learned to think this way as a consequence of writing this book, is that our stories, our lives with our families, are, of course, it's what's happening to us from one year to the next. But I also have learned that, at least I think, that it seems to me almost as important how, and now especially that I have kids, it's as important to me what my kids will think of me, or what their kids will think of me down the road someday when I'm dead and gone. And that we really, the things that I do while raising my kids, really, I'm doing a lot of either good or bad in raising them, and their lives are going to be shaped quite a lot by what I teach them and what I do. And I thought, that's kind of, since it's true in life, I think it's true, and it can be true in literature. And I wanted a doorway into the next book, which was part of the intention with the end of this book. But I also thought it can't the real ending of this book is when Ode returns home, with Harry, and they roll in and they're home and he's back where he is. That's the end of it. But I wanted, and I thought often about leaving it there, and just that being the end. But I also thought, there should be a glimpse into the future. There should be something that shows that, that at least teases the reader into knowing that they've made it. They've made it. And in terms of what actually happens out on the lake, you'll have to read the next book to find out. Not to be clear. Yeah, I'm about halfway done with it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the
I had in my mind, for one, and I got a lot of pushback on this from my editor because he thought, he challenged me to think about why Ode didn't just stay in Duluth. And the answer that I gave him, and the answer that I believe, is there's a couple of reasons. For one, he is a Gunflinter. He says that I was born here. This is my place. It's my place as much as his, more than his even. I've lived here just as long as him being Hosea. I have my fish house and the farm that I inherited, and I have a life there that I deserve that. I want to be there. That's where I'm from. And I feel kind of territorial like that about where I'm from. So in that way, I guess I identify with Ode a little bit. Not like I've left for long. I mean, I went to graduate school, but otherwise I'm from Minneapolis, and I'm from Minnesota. I'm from Minneapolis. That's who I am. But I also really wanted to, for the purposes of the story and the narrative, I wanted to get Ode back there to have that moment of confrontation and to show what I think is that Hosea has seen what all of his intentions, good and bad, have gotten him, and that is Ode's despising him, and Rebecca's sort of looniness. I mean, in my mind, she's sort of lost her mind at the end of the book, and certainly in my mind as I play her forward, she sort of becomes the sort of mad woman in the attic, in a very tragic but inevitable sort of way, given where she came from and where where she's been and the decisions that she's made. And I don't judge her for that. I don't judge her at all, in fact. I do have judgment for Hosea, and I think that he's just gotten what he deserves, and that is his life is in ruins because he has lived such a duplicitous life, and he's, it's sort of like if you lie long enough, the lies are going to come back and get you. Well, the lies have come back to get him, and now he's a broken man, and where once he was so sure and sure of himself and strong, he's now just a weak and beaten man, and Ode has done the beating. Not intentionally. I mean, he doesn't come back to beat him. He comes back because it's his place. And maybe there's a little bit of, I'm going to show him that I'm not afraid of him, and I'm Ode not being afraid of Hosea. So it's a complicated reason for coming back, but I think it's also the sort of inevitable, at least in my mind as the story goes, the inevitable choice that he has to make. He's not, he has no more business being in Duluth than Hosea has being in Gunflint. And he recognizes that and wants to go back because of it. And he also wants to take his boy on a cruise on the boat, his pride, if you will. So it's very complicated, and it could go either way. It could have gone either way. But I'm very glad that he goes back. And I love the idea that they go back and make a little life for themselves and stick it out, friends as much as father and son, but of course with all of the benefits of Ode's good wisdom for Harry. Yeah.
And one thing that I wanted to mention too that
Well, and actually I think I'm glad that you had that reaction because I think a lot of people are confused by it, and sort of understandably. I mean, her motivations aren't exactly clear. All along, they're not exactly clear. But I think that when people suggest that to me, I think, well, but our motivations are so seldom clear. I mean, sometimes they are, of course. I've got to get to the grocery store today to buy a gallon of milk. I'm going to go do that. But there's a lot of things that I think we do in life, and a lot of the decisions that we make, and a lot of the feelings that we have that aren't guided by logic or some mechanical impulse that we have. They're guided by our feelings and our emotions. And her whole life is, she has virtually none of the mechanical ability, and she exists purely in this sort of airy emotional realm. And I think that's finally her fatal flaw, And again, it's not her fault. I don't judge her for it at all. But I think that she couldn't. And of course, there's the issue of how the town deals with it. This is a small town where everyone knows everyone and everything. But I'm also comfortable with the fact that in a small town like that, especially given the large personalities in the drama, that that no doubt people are going home and over their venison steaks talking about what's going on at the apothecary. They're a bunch of Norwegians. They're not out on the street corner talking about it. They're keeping it to themselves and no doubt passing judgment themselves, but it's their business and this is our business, and that's how it is. And that's one of the things that I love about Minnesota. You have it even, we live in Southwest Minneapolis, and we had a bunch of friends over for dinner last night, and you could just tell, moving from group to group and talking to people, that still exists. That ability to not talk about it. We have a friend going through something very difficult, and it would be acknowledged, but you could tell everyone's mind just going like this, but no one is saying, "Oh, can you believe this?" And I like that. I don't know that you get that everywhere. I don't know if you don't get it everywhere, but I don't know if you do either. I spend as much time up on the North Shore as I can, not just researching, but recreating as well. It's sort of where it's our vacation destination for the most. We go other places, of course, but we go up there every summer and every winter at least once as a family, and I go up there other times. There's nothing about the North Shore that I don't love, especially going up in the Boundary Waters and going canoeing or hiking or running on the Superior Hiking Trail, or even just being in the towns. I love being in the towns and going into the Blue Water Cafe and just listening to the locals talk about deer hunting season or where the fish are biting and that sort of thing. And I would love to live up there, but it's impossible to. So a big part of my research is just going there and being a sponge. Every time I'm there, I carry a notebook, I write things down, and I just try to sort of soak it up. And I'm there. I'm up north at least 5 or 6 times a year. And when I was researching Safe from the Sea, it was before I had kids, and I would go up there all the time. I was probably up there 30 times over 30 weekends researching, spending time in the library in Duluth and Two Harbors and just walking around towns and talking to people in the bars and cafes, and really feel like though I'm not from there, it's close enough to here and I've spent enough time there that I feel like I have some sense of who the people are. And that to me, frankly, is more important than whether or not she's wearing that apron in the book, or whether the geography is true to life, or the way they talk, or those sorts of things. But I do try to be accurate with that stuff as well, with the sort of the nuts and bolts. One example that comes to mind every time I think of this is there's a scene in The Lighthouse Robe when Ode and Rebecca get to Duluth and they go to a hotel and they're brought champagne. And I talk about them pouring champagne into their flutes. Well, it turns out that the champagne flute wasn't really invented until the 1940s or something like that. So I had to, and that sort of thing. So I try to be as true to life as I can possibly be. But I also have no doubt that there are mistakes. I had no idea about champagne flutes. It was my agent, actually. Not even my editor or my copy editor that caught that. It was my agent that caught that. So, yeah. So, yeah. And I'm also on the subject of research. I'm not systematic or even especially organized about it, and I don't want to be. I'm intentionally, I think of it as jungle researching. I just go into a subject and start poking my way around. Usually that's vis-a-vis some book or some other written artifact, letters or newspaper articles or those sorts of things. And when I find things that are interesting, I just sort of lift them out and build that way instead of going in looking for a subject or looking for certain facts about the subject. I'd rather find them. It just makes it seem a little bit more organic or possible or natural or something like that.
For all of the
Yeah.
other characters that we didn't know anything about.
Yeah. What I was really in this series of pictures, there's probably, I don't know, 6 or 8 photographs, and the women are in 2 of them, but the rest of them are just the conditions in these. And the conditions in this particular camp do not mimic the conditions in the camp that I write about. This camp, for example, they and I make reference to it, I think, in the vis-a-vis the character of Trond, the camp foreman, who had been in this business for a long time, and it says something about he remembered the Camboose shanties, and these are Camboose shanty lumbermen, which means that the whole outfit was in one place. Their meals all winter long were cooked in enormous, bigger than this table vats over a big open fire. Their bunks were on the other side of this. The sharpening stone was in the middle of it, and they just lived here. And I don't know what it is about that just had my attention, and I ended up doing a lot of reading about that and about the lumber camps as a sort of way of, as I was piecing together in my mind the story that could be hers in this lumber camp. But it's such a, it's almost impossible to believe now. Everyone I know goes to work in an office building or in some place that's very finished and types on a computer or answers a phone or whatever. And these guys doing this just incredibly difficult job, physically difficult job, and unbelievably difficult conditions. It was just, I felt like making that choice and landing on that choice to write about that was just like I struck gold, because it's just so interesting to me. In their lives, they never talked. They were there all winter, and except for Saturday night when they got the rum out, they didn't talk. They didn't do anything except go into the woods when it's 30 degrees below zero and chop down trees, and then come back and eat 3 times a day and go to sleep and do it 6 days a week all winter long.
Frostbite had to be terrible.
Yeah. They're the toughest bunch of people I bet that ever existed. And I know that people still do those jobs. I just don't know any of them. If not the job that they do, other jobs that are just as difficult and physically challenging, and the conditions of their employment are just as challenging in similar or dissimilar ways. But I have the same feeling when I read about what's going on up in North Dakota now. This sort of, the oil boom and all these men going to that place and living this sort of rough life. I think it's quite different, and based on the reports that I read, which I'm not researching it, but just what I come across when I come across it, and how rough the towns have become, that it's different. They were pretty civilized, actually. There was not a lot of crime in these camps. They went to work and they got their pay at the end of each week, and they bought a new wool shirt to keep them extra warm, and then in the springtime they went back to their families and back to their summer jobs, which for a lot of them were fishing on the lakes or any number of things. But I was just endlessly fascinated by it, and that fascination is really the fuel for you put all of these interesting things together, interesting for me at least, and start playing magic with them and putting it all together. That's really, that's the fun in it for me. Yeah. But they're just unbelievable, the life that they lived. How did I decide I wanted to be a writer? When I was in high school, I was not a particularly good student, not particularly interested in in academics at all. And I had a teacher who just sort of straightened me up one day, and he was an English teacher, and challenged me to just give it a try. Just read the book and give it a try. And I did. And it was, I guess it was as much a threat as it was a challenge, if I'm being honest. But I almost thought, I'm going to show this guy. I'm going to show him that I can read the book and still not be interested. But the book was Hemingway's A Farewell to Arm, and I was a junior in high school, and I read it, and I loved it. I mean, I was totally taken away. And of course, I'd read books before that, but never had an experience that was so powerful and moving. And I literally decided after reading a couple more Hemingway books that that's what I wanted to do, which isn't to say that I spent a lot of time writing in the next 10 years, but I always wanted to do it, and I was reading a ton. Even then, it started me on a path to reading that has had more to do with me being a writer than any writing classes or even any writing that I've done. I mean, it's these books and how they've informed me, not just intellectually and emotionally, but as a writer. Learning how to tell stories and learning how to think about stories and characters and those sorts of things. So it's a simple story. I read a Hemingway book that I loved, sold to me by an English teacher who maybe saw something in me, or at least was tired of my shenanigans in class, and so it goes. I'm often asked that question because I do have a pretty diverse resume. I've done a lot of different things, and the short answer is no. Nothing in my work life has interested me in such a way that I think, I would love to write about mortgage bankers someday. I think that would be an awesome story. So from that point of view, the answer is no, but I also really believe that, whether you're talking about what people are capable of or what people are afraid of or what people really want, of course I've learned, whether sort of directly or indirectly or consciously or subconsciously, how people get through their days. And I've heard lots of terrible stories and lots of wonderful stories about, a guy's wife leaving him for another man, or about a guy with a very sick child, or about the death of a coworker, the death of a coworker's parent. You make friends with people, you interact with them as we do in everyday life, and of course that influences how I understand people and how I write about them. So, though I'll never write a novel about a mortgage banker, there is that. Yeah, I think it's difficult to make sense of that because, because most of that I'm not writing about it in my notebook. When I have a conversation, have had conversations with coworkers, and not just coworkers, it's anyone you meet in life. But if you're a writer, and maybe even people who aren't, you're constantly building a story around the stories that you hear, whether you intend to write about it or not. You just start. I at least just start inventing, what could have led up to this moment and what's going to happen going forward. And sometimes you have the benefit of knowing those things, and sometimes you don't. But there's just no way that it doesn't influence you and influence me. So. And again, something that I learned in the writing of it is the further away I am from my own experience, not just the historical distance, but writing from a woman's point of view and writing a story set here and these sorts of characters, the further I am away from my really mundane day-to-day existence, which involves getting up and pouring Cheerios for my kids and doing the dishes and going to the grocery store and making dinner and putting the kids down, which is what I do, 7 days a week. The farther I am away from that, the easier it is. The easier it is for me. And that's true, not just with my current job, taking care of the kids and being a stay-at-home dad, but about all the jobs that I've had in the past too. The more I get to just revel in my imagination, the happier I am. Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Now we can get out and get a little of that sunshine before it starts sleeting again this week. But thank you all for coming. If you'd like a copy of the book signed, I see a couple of you have them. I'll be happy to do that. Otherwise, thank you very much.